December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. For the German soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, this was supposed to be a day of triumph. They were the tip of the spear in Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war, an overwhelming surprise attack that had shattered the quiet American front. The air, thick with fog and the smell of pine, crackled with the energy of the offensive. They had survived the Eastern Front. They had stared down the Red Army, and they knew the sounds of battle like the beat of their own hearts. They knew the whistle of incoming artillery, the crump of an impact, the specific geometry of a shell crater that you could use for cover. War had rules, terrifying, brutal rules, but rules nonetheless. But this morning, the rules were breaking. The American artillery began to answer their assault, but it was wrong. The high-pitched scream of the shells was familiar, but the ending wasn't. There were no impacts, no geysers of frozen earth and shattered rock. Instead, the shells were simply vanishing in mid-air, replaced by a sharp, deafening crack directly overhead. And then came the rain, a perfectly even, impossibly dense storm of shrapnel that swept through the forest with the force of a hurricane. It didn't matter if you were in a foxhole behind a century-old oak tree or huddled in a ditch. The steel came from above, scything through branches, uniforms, and flesh with horrifying impartiality. Panic began to set in. This wasn't artillery. This was witchcraft. It was as if every shell had an eye, as if it could see them hiding and choose the perfect moment to detonate. Seasoned veterans, men who had learned to survive by hugging the earth, were being torn apart in the very holes they had dug for protection. Entire squads, advancing in perfect formation just moments before, were now just crimson stains on the snow. They were facing an enemy who had seemingly weaponized the sky itself. What was this new form of death? How could an explosive shell know exactly when and where to explode to cause the most possible damage? The German soldiers had no way of knowing it, but they had just become the unwilling test subjects for the second most important secret weapon of World War II. What they were facing was the battlefield debut of the proximity Fuze, a device so revolutionary, so far beyond the accepted science of the day, that its development was shrouded in secrecy on par with the Manhattan Project. And at that very moment, the man responsible for unleashing it was knowingly and brazenly violating a direct order from the highest levels of Allied command. Colonel Oscar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group was watching his sector near Monschau crumble. The thin line of the American 38th Cavalry Squadron was about to be swallowed whole by the German advance. His conventional artillery wasn't stopping them. He knew he had two choices: follow his orders and watch his men be overrun, or unleash the secret weapon sitting in his ammunition depot and risk a court-martial. For Axelson, the choice was simple. He gave the order that would change the course of the battle, and in doing so, change the very nature of warfare forever. The order was to load the shells marked VT, variable time. Inside each of these shells was something that German intelligence believed to be impossible. A miniature, self-contained radar system, small enough to fit in a coffee can, yet rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon. A device that would multiply the lethality of artillery not by 10 or 20%, but by an astonishing 50 times. The mathematics of death were about to be rewritten in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. To understand the sheer impossibility of what the German soldiers were facing, you have to understand the problem that had plagued artillery for centuries. A standard artillery shell is only truly effective if it detonates at the perfect moment. A ground burst shell, the most common type, spends most of its explosive energy digging a useless crater in the dirt. Much of its shrapnel is absorbed by the ground, flying harmlessly upwards. To be truly devastating against troops in the open or in foxholes, you needed an airburst. You needed the shell to explode above your target, allowing its fragments to rain down in a deadly cone. For centuries, the only way to achieve this was with a time fuse, a complex, clockwork-like mechanism at the tip of the shell that you would manually set to detonate after a certain number of seconds. But time fuses were a terribly imperfect science. You had to calculate the shell's flight time with perfect accuracy. A tiny miscalculation in range, a slight variation in wind speed, a change in air pressure, or an error by a tired, freezing gunner, and your shell would either explode hundreds of feet in the air, its shrapnel scattering harmlessly, or bury itself in the ground before detonating, a so-called dud. Best case scenario only, about 1 in 5 time-fused shells actually detonated effectively. The Allies needed a better way. They needed a shell that could think for itself, a shell that could see its target and decide for itself the perfect moment to explode. The question was, how do you give a shell eyes? The answer came from a group of civilian scientists led by a visionary physicist named Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Their laboratory wasn't some grand university building. It was a disguised used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. The secrecy was absolute. At its peak, this single project employed 3% of all physicists in the United States, yet none of them could tell their families what they were working on. Their mission sounded like something from a Buck Rogers comic strip. Build a fully functional radar set, a device that, at the time, was the size of a refrigerator and filled with delicate glass vacuum tubes, and shrink it down to the size of a milk bottle. Then, make it tough enough to survive the most violent event in conventional warfare, being fired from an artillery gun. The forces involved are almost beyond human comprehension. The moment a shell is fired, it experiences an acceleration of 20,000 Gs. That is 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. A 1-pound object would momentarily weigh 10 tons. A human body would be crushed into a microscopic smear. On top of that, the shell is spinning at an incredible 25,000 revolutions per minute, creating massive centrifugal forces that try to tear everything inside it apart. And it has to do all this while surviving the searing heat of the gun barrel and the sub-zero temperatures at the peak of its trajectory. The challenge was to build a radio transmitter and receiver, complete with fragile glass vacuum tubes that could not only survive this ordeal but switch on and function perfectly in the milliseconds after being fired. The initial attempts were catastrophic failures. They'd pack a prototype fuse into a shell, fire it, and recover nothing but a mangled mess of wires and shattered glass. The vacuum tubes, the heart of any radio at the time, were the biggest problem. They were designed for the gentle environment of a living room radio, not the inside of a cannon. They shattered every single time. The project seemed doomed. But the team, driven by the urgency of the war, refused to give up. They came up with ingenious solutions. They cushioned the components in rubber and wax. They redesigned the internal structures of the tubes, supporting the delicate filaments like suspension bridges. One physicist, James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering the Earth's radiation belts, developed a rugged vacuum tube so small and tough it looked like a pencil eraser. Then came the problem of power. How do you power a radio and a device that has no room for a battery? The solution was pure genius. They placed the battery's electrolyte in a small glass ampule. When the shell was fired, The immense G-force would instantly shatter the ampule, releasing the electrolyte and activating the battery, which would then power the device for the few seconds of its flight. The device worked using the Doppler effect. The tiny radio transmitter in the Fuze sent out a continuous radio wave. As the shell flew, these waves would bounce off the ground or any other object below. As the shell got closer to the ground, the frequency of the returning, reflected wave would change. The Fuze's receiver was designed to detect this change. When the reflected signal reached a specific predetermined strength, calibrated to correspond to the perfect burst height of about 30 to 50 feet, it would trigger an electronic switch, detonating the shell. It was a self-contained, self-powered, intelligent weapon. A billion-dollar gamble, second only in cost to the atomic bomb, that was about to pay off in the most spectacular and terrifying way imaginable. Back in the Ardennes, Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision had an effect that was immediate and utterly apocalyptic for the attacking Germans. The advance of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division didn't just slow down, it ceased to exist. Formations that had been confidently advancing moments earlier were simply erased from the battlefield. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical destruction. These soldiers were veterans. They understood the logic of combat. But there was no logic to this. Reports flying back to German command were filled with disbelief and terror. They described artillery that seemed to be guided by magic, shells that anticipated their movements, and a level of lethality they had never encountered. The news of what happened at Monschau traveled up the American chain of command with the speed of a lit fuse. Colonel Axelson was in serious trouble. He had violated a clear directive. The proximity fuse had been used successfully by the Navy for months as an anti-aircraft weapon, but its use over land was strictly forbidden. The fear was that a dud shell would be recovered by the Germans, who would then reverse engineer the technology and turn it against Allied bomber formations, potentially costing thousands of airmen's lives. But Axelson's gamble had worked. He had stopped a major German assault cold, saving a crucial part of the American line. Now, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had a difficult choice to make. The Battle of the Bulge was turning into a catastrophe. American forces were reeling all along the 85-mile front. The situation was desperate. Was the risk of the Germans capturing the secret worth the potential reward of turning this revolutionary weapon on their armies? On December 19th, Eisenhower made his decision. He formally requested authorization to use the proximity fuses across the entire front. By December 21st, the order came down. All restrictions were lifted. The secret was out. What followed was a stunning display of American logistical might. Within days, trucks were racing across the icy roads of France and Belgium, delivering crates of the precious shells to beleaguered artillery units. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit holding the line near Bastogne, received their shipment. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their mobile M7 Priest howitzers, got theirs. And crucially, the surrounded and outnumbered 101st Airborne Division, clinging desperately to the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, received an airdrop supply. The Fuze was about to be put to its ultimate test. The Siege of Bastogne is one of the most legendary chapters of the Second World War. The 101st Airborne, completely cut off and surrounded by overwhelming German forces, famously refused a surrender demand with the iconic one-word reply, "Nuts?" But their bravado masked the desperate situation. They were running low on everything. What they did have, however, was artillery, specifically the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and their 75mm pack howitzers. And now they had the new proximity-fused shells. The German strategy was simple: continuous, massive infantry assaults designed to overwhelm the American defenders through sheer numbers. But this strategy relied on the traditional rules of warfare. When the German assaults began, their formations were caught in a nightmare. As they advanced across the open, snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne, the American artillery opened up. But instead of random craters appearing in the snow, the air above the German ranks erupted into a canopy of steel. The proximity fuses, requiring no careful aiming or precise calculation, turned the sky into a killing zone. Entire platoons were wiped out in a single salvo. The shells detonated at their perfect 30-foot height, spraying shrapnel downwards with mathematical efficiency. There was no escape. Hitting the ground only made you a more stationary target for the next volley. The psychological effect was profound. German prisoners captured during the siege were often incoherent, babbling about invisible explosions and a sky that rained death. They reported that their units would lose all cohesion before they even got close to the American lines, with soldiers breaking and running from the incomprehensible slaughter. The defenders of Bastogne, though surrounded, had achieved a technological superiority that made them invincible. The German ring around the town was not just a line on a map. It was a 360-degree firing range for the most advanced weapon on the battlefield. While Bastogne held, another, even more chilling demonstration of the Fuze's power was about to unfold. General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing north to relieve the surrounded 101st. On Christmas night, 1944, near the town of Echternach, American intelligence detected a German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen Sauer River under the cover of darkness and thick fog. In normal conditions, this would have been a perfect opportunity for the Germans. American forward observers couldn't see them to adjust artillery fire. It would have been a slow, inaccurate process of firing and guessing. But the proximity fuse didn't need to see. It only needed to sense. Patton, who was near the front, witnessed the event and recorded it with cold precision in his war diary. As the German soldiers waded into the icy water, confident they were invisible, the American artillery opened fire. The proximity-fused shells screamed across the dark sky. They didn't need to hit the riverbank. They just needed to get close. As they passed over the river, the Fuze's tiny radar sets detected the surface of the water and the soldiers on it. They detonated. In the pitch-black fog, the river crossing became a charnel house. The shells burst perfectly above the heads of the trapped men, showering them with fragments. They had nowhere to go. They were caught between the river and the relentless, intelligent fire. When the firing finally stopped and the sun rose, American patrols went to survey the scene. Patton wrote, "When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. An entire German battalion, nearly 1,000 men, had ceased to exist in a matter of minutes. This wasn't a battle. It was an extermination." The news of the Sauer River slaughter spread like wildfire through the German ranks, and soldiers began refusing orders to conduct similar river crossings. The Fuze wasn't just killing soldiers, it was killing their will to fight. The unique terrain of the Ardennes, with its dense forests, was something the Germans had counted on as an advantage. The thick woods provided excellent cover from air attack and concealed their troop movements. But with the arrival of the proximity fuse, the forest, their greatest asset, was transformed into their deadliest trap. In open country, an airburst was devastating enough. But in a forest, the effect was multiplied exponentially. When a 155mm proximity-fused shell detonated above the forest canopy, it was like a thunderclap. The initial blast of steel fragments would have been lethal on its own. But then came the secondary effect. The shrapnel shredded the massive frozen branches of the ancient trees, creating thousands of secondary projectiles, wooden splinters, some as long and thick as a man's arm, that shot downwards and outwards at hundreds of feet per second. Every tree became a potential source of death. The traditional tactics of forest warfare, honed over centuries, became instantly obsolete. Taking cover behind a large tree was useless. The shrapnel and splinters came from above. Digging a foxhole under a root system was a death sentence. American artillerymen quickly learned to fire their proximity-fused shells directly into the treetops. A single shell could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all life, creating a 360-degree kill zone that was impossible to survive. German units, trained to disperse in forests to avoid casualties, found that this tactic just made them more vulnerable to the wide area of effect. Bunching together for mutual support meant an entire squad could be annihilated by a single, perfectly placed shell. There was no correct tactical answer. The forest, once a sanctuary, now held a unique and terrifying danger. The very environment had been turned against them by this new American technology. You might wonder, with such a game-changing weapon, how did the Germans not see it coming? How could their famed intelligence services have missed this? The tragic irony is, they didn't just miss it. They had it in their hands and dismissed it as impossible. In the chaos of the initial offensive, German troops overran a massive American ammunition depot. Inside, they found a windfall. Crates containing approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This should have been an intelligence coup of epic proportions, a chance to immediately understand and counter the new threat. The captured fuses were rushed back to German technical experts. They carefully disassembled the devices, and what they found inside baffled them. They saw the miniature vacuum tubes, the intricate wiring, the clever battery design, and they declared it was impossible. Their own scientific dogma blinded them. German engineers were convinced that a delicate glass vacuum tube could never survive the shock of being fired from a cannon. They had concluded it was physically impossible. Therefore, they reasoned, the components they were looking at must be a clever American trick, a decoy to hide the real mechanism, which they speculated might be some form of magnetic or acoustic trigger. This failure of imagination was rooted in their own abandoned research. Germany had actually been a pioneer in proximity fuse technology before the war. Companies like Rheinmetall Borsig had working prototypes as early as 1940. But in a moment of supreme arrogance, Hitler had issued a decree canceling any weapons project that would take more than 6 months to reach production, believing the war would be over quickly. The German proximity fuse program was shelved. Their engineers, unable to believe that the Americans had solved the very problems they had given up on, simply refused to accept the evidence right in front of them. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, would later admit during his post-war interrogation that Germany's own advanced fuse designs were only 3 or 4 months away from mass production when the war ended. They were on the brink of matching the technology, but a combination of bureaucratic short-sightedness and intellectual arrogance had cost them dearly. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the full scale of the American industrial miracle behind the fuse became apparent. This wasn't the work of one secret lab. It was the coordinated effort of over 100 American companies. The Crosley Corporation, famous for its home refrigerators, completely retooled its factories to assemble the complex fuses. Emerson Radio stopped making radios for families and started producing weapons of war. Industrial giants like RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania dedicated entire facilities and their best engineers to the program. The level of quality control was unlike anything seen before in mass production. Every single one of the 130 components in each fuse was individually tested. Every solder joint was examined under a microscope. Random samples were taken from the production line each day and test-fired from cannons to ensure they worked. The rejection rate was astronomical. Any part that showed the slightest imperfection was immediately discarded. The workforce that achieved this miracle was composed largely of women. They worked grueling 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in factories under the tightest security. Due to the intense compartmentalization of the project, they had no idea what they were actually building. They were only told that it was a top-secret project, vital to the war effort. They meticulously assembled these instruments of unprecedented lethality, carrying the burden of their secret work in enforced silence, and their output was staggering. By December 1944, American industry was churning out one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock. The cost, through this incredible efficiency of mass production, had plummeted. In 1942, a single fuse cost $7.32, more than the average worker's annual salary. By the end of the war, the price had dropped to just $18 per unit. Over the course of the war, America produced 22 million fuses. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, 200,000 of them would be fired, each one a testament to the industrial power that Germany had so fatally underestimated. No one understood the tactical value of this new weapon better than General George S. Patton. As his Third Army hammered its way north, he used the proximity fuse as his primary breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, threw out the old rulebook and developed entirely new tactics to maximize the fuse's effectiveness. He pioneered a technique called time on target, where multiple artillery battalions, miles apart, would coordinate their fire with mathematical precision. They would all fire at the same target, but at slightly different times, calculated so that all of their shells would arrive at the exact same second. The effect on the receiving end was beyond imagination. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of proximity-fused shells would detonate simultaneously over a single target. The Germans who survived called it the bell toll of death, a single, earth-shattering moment where the entire sky would explode. Between December 22nd and December 29th, Patton's Third Army fired over 50,000 proximity-fused shells, blasting a corridor through the German defenses to finally relieve the heroes of Bastogne. Patton himself, never one for understatement, wrote simply in a letter, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Perhaps the most mathematically brutal example of the fuse's impact occurred on Elsenborn Ridge, a critical piece of high ground on the northern edge of the Bulge. Here, 2 American infantry divisions, the 2nd and the 99th, were dug in against the cream of the German military. The 6th SS Panzer Army, including Hitler's own elite bodyguard division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. For 3 days, from December 17th to the 19th, the SS launched relentless, fanatical assaults up the steep, forested slopes of the ridge. The American artillery response was overwhelming. In that 72-hour period, they fired an incredible 160,000 artillery rounds. Of those, about 40,000, a quarter of the total, were proximity fused. Post-battle analysis revealed a startling statistic that 25% of shells, the proximity-fused ones, were responsible for an estimated 60% of the 5,000 German casualties on the ridge. The math was undeniable. In this specific engagement, the fuse had made American artillery 4 times more effective. The elite of the Waffen-SS, soldiers indoctrinated with a belief in their own invincibility, were shattered. They charged up the hills into a wall of air-bursting steel and wood splinters. Entire companies vanished in the blink of an eye. Survivors reported having to climb over mounds of their own dead to continue the attack. After 3 days of this horrific slaughter, the attacks stopped. The best soldiers Germany had were broken, not by superior numbers or a brilliant tactical maneuver, but by a superior piece of technology they simply could not counter. The Fuze's final decisive contribution to the battle came on New Year's Day, 1945. In a last-ditch effort, the German Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack by 900 fighter planes against Allied airfields. The attack achieved complete surprise, destroying hundreds of Allied planes on the ground. But as the German pilots turned for home, their victory turned to ashes. They flew directly into a curtain of anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything they had ever faced. The proximity fuse had originally been designed for this exact purpose, and now it was deployed in vast numbers. The fuses didn't require a direct hit. They only needed to get close to a plane. As a German fighter flew past, the shell's radar would sense it and detonate, creating a massive cloud of shrapnel directly in its path. Pilots trained to evade traditional, predictable anti-aircraft fire found themselves helpless. The shells seemed to anticipate their evasive maneuvers. Of the 207 German planes lost that day, a staggering 172 were shot down by anti-aircraft guns, most of them firing proximity fuses. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by years of war, never recovered from the losses of that single day. By early January 1945, the secret was impossible to keep. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers on both sides had witnessed their unbelievable effects. The War Department finally authorized a limited disclosure to the public, and newspapers began printing vague stories about a new, magic artillery shell that was multiplying the effectiveness of American guns. It was too late for German intelligence to do anything about it. A captured German report from January 10th stated with grim finality, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effects. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." The war in Europe would last another 4 months, but Hitler's final offensive was crushed. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25th, 1945. It had cost Germany 100,000 casualties and depleted its last reserves of men and machines. In post-war interrogations, Germany's top commanders were unanimous in their assessment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, testified, "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops." The legacy of this tiny device extends far beyond the battlefields of World War II. The scientific and engineering breakthroughs required to create the proximity fuse laid the foundation for the entire modern electronics industry. The rugged, miniaturized vacuum tubes were the direct ancestors of the transistor. The quality control methods pioneered in the fuse factories became the gold standard for manufacturing worldwide. Dr. James Van Allen, the man who designed the tough little vacuum tubes, would later use those same principles to build instruments for the first American satellites, discovering the radiation belts that now bear his name. But most importantly, the core concept of the proximity fuse, a weapon with a sensor that can perceive its environment and make a decision, was the birth of smart weapons. Every guided missile, every smart bomb, every autonomous drone on the battlefields of today owes its existence to the fundamental principle first proven in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The revolution started by that first unauthorized order from Colonel Axelson continues to this day. The German soldiers who perished under that strange, intelligent artillery were not just casualties of a battle. They were the first casualties of a new technological age of warfare. An age where victory is determined not just by courage or tactics, but by the relentless and terrifying logic of superior science.